And look at that, colossally, it's Mansell. That is Nigel Mansell. Good old Murray. Hello and welcome to Very Much Mistaken. Chris and James are going to be reviewing the first Grand Prix of the season in Bahrain, and what a race it was.
So, initial thoughts then on as we finish watching first Grand Prix then. Go on then.
It was what everyone was hoping for, I think, except for maybe the result, which is good and not good. I think it's good in the fact that it was great to see Hamilton and Verstappen going at it for a full 56 laps. It was great that pound for pound, Red Bull, I think, over the course of the weekend were the strongest package. What is not so great, perhaps, is that in spite of all of that, Lewis Hamilton still won the race. So if this is Mercedes on the ropes, what does that mean for the future? I suppose ultimately what's really exciting about it is we've had a race now and we don't really know how the season's going to unfold in the way that we have in the past. And the longer that uncertainty remains, the better.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I say, whilst it was kind of like Mercedes on the ropes and still won, I think Red Bull can be fairly, really confident coming out of that. They can be annoyed that they lost it, but they can be really, really confident because I think it was quite obvious that they had the faster car on that weekend. I think it was it Karen Chanduk? I think he might have said that he thought that this was a Mercedes track as well. So this is Red Bull showing up, almost showing up Mercedes on a track that probably suits Mercedes a bit better. I reckon a lot of Mercedes doing well is down to their experience being at the front of races and knowing how to just knowing how to act with them. Whereas I think Red Bull haven't realistically been contending for race wins in quite a while. And the main incident from the race was Verstappen overtaking Hamilton off the track limits and having to give up his place again. I mean, the thing is, if like Verstappen I'm sure he'd probably say himself he could have made that pass without going over track limits. So just like a minor, you could say minor driver error has meant that Red Bull probably feel bad and Mercedes feel good, but that's how close it was during the race.
And that's what bodes well moving forward, of course, is that fine margins are going to decide outcomes in a way that they haven't perhaps in the past, because Mercedes have had such a performance advantage that they could overcome small errors, be that on track or within the team, and still prevail. This year, Red Bull are going to hold them account, and they're going to hold Red Bull to account, and that makes for an exciting season. I think if we sort of take the race chronologically at the front at any rate, the first, I think the key aspect of the first stint was that Hamilton was able to stay within striking range of Verstappen and make them vulnerable to the undercut, which appeared to be particularly powerful in Bahrain this year.
Yeah, I mean, so Hamilton pitted early, and then Verstappen stayed out for a few laps. And it was as if they were trying to kind of like counteract the undercut by going longer on old tyres. And again, maybe that's Red Bull not having all the answers when leading that they are used to having. So for instance, Mercedes over the past few seasons, they might have more experience preempting an undercut like that than Red Bull do. And you could argue that again. So you make the point that, you know, did Red Bull stay out on old tyres, which gave Hamilton a better advantage? But again, Red Bull had a chance to win it at the end. So it's a tough one to judge where up to that mistakes were made. But Hamilton. I mean, Verstappen clearly like having a faster car and Hamilton being able to eke out what he could eke out everything he could to keep up with Verstappen Verstappen at the start for like the first section was yeah, I mean, it just shows Hamilton is not just a car, is it? Doesn't it? So,
and all of his 3 stints were crucial in putting him in a position at the end to be able to fend Verstappen off. I think in terms of not trying to cover the undercut, it's just a fact of the order that the cars appear that, in a way, if there's a powerful undercut and you're close enough, you're at an advantage to be the second car of 2, because you can commit to coming into the pits after the guy in front of you has committed to not. And I think Red Bull, obviously not being inside the team, I think they probably assess that we are the fastest team, so we are going to go with the optimum strategy in terms of stint length and what the tyres are capable of doing, regardless of what Mercedes are doing, and back Max to pass, which basically happened, but for his running wide.
Yeah, and then there was a decision for Lewis to go on a really long stint on his final set of tyres, which was where the excitement came from, because Max, I can't remember what lap Max pitted on, but I think he pitted on around like lap 40 or something.
And that decision was triggered by Max getting close enough to Lewis to be in range to undercut him. So Mercedes were covering the undercut, were preempting the undercut by bringing Lewis in the hope that to give him track position for the last stint ultimately, and hope that he could sustain enough performance in the tyres to be able to keep Verstappen at bay. And it was so interesting as we moved into that last phase about how people, you often hear racing drivers, it's something Martin Brundle says a lot on the Sky Sports F1 commentary, that as a driver is catching another one, he always says he's got to nail him straight away, because if you don't, the driver in front can pick up on where the driver behind is quicker than them and adjust their driving, and you can get sucked into a rhythm of just following a car. That means if you don't make that move at the first opportunity, it becomes increasingly harder to do it. That was very clear that Max essentially had one chance and he took it, but just didn't quite execute it. And I was surprised watching the laps after the move and when he had to give it back that he didn't really have another shot after that.
Yeah, I found that so interesting, because he closed down on Lewis so easily, made the pass fairly easily, but then went over track limits. As soon as he let him go, I was just expecting Verstappen to be able to pass him again in a few laps, but he never really looked comfortable at all after that. And I mean, I assumed it was something to do with Lewis being able to had saved up a lot of his ERS or something, and he was able to kind of use that at the appropriate moment, so he wasn't able to get in DRS range or wasn't able to get close enough, even if he had DRS to make a viable pass. Watching
Toto's reaction, a guy who's been at the top of a team that has just won its 7th Drivers' and Constructors' Championship in a row, was celebrating like it was his first ever win in Formula One. And it's so interesting to see, is that kind of attitude to winning and sport and competition indicative of any team that has achieved great success? Is it necessary to be that sort of competitive? Is it innate? Is it something that's built culturally at Mercedes, that we just want to win and we celebrate every win like it's our first or like it's going to be our last? Because you would have thought he never won a race before to see him celebrate. And I wonder if they are... I really get the sense that obviously Red Bull are enjoying being competitive because they haven't been at the start of a season in a long time. But I really get the sense that Mercedes are enjoying having a genuine threat, someone to race against rather than just themselves. And they're relishing that challenge. And it seems to be bringing the best out of them.
You get the impression that winning this one would mean more to Mercedes than the rest of them, 100%.
So to close the loop on the front of the race, I did just want to discuss track limits and what a pig's ear it sounds like that the stewards made of it in this event. I don't know how it sounded like their interpretations of it changed, flip-flopped throughout the weekend and during the race. At one stage we had this ridiculous scenario where Red Bull were telling Max to to exploit the track limits around turn 4, because Mercedes have been doing it all race, only for Bono to be telling Lewis that he needs to stop doing that because the stewards have told him he's doing it too much. And there's a very obvious solution to this, and that is to not make the limits beyond the limits of the track quicker than sticking to the track. If you had, obviously they were taken out because of safety grounds, but the massive curbs they had in the mid-90s were things that drivers steered clear of. And one of the features of having grass and gravel traps was that you didn't want to run over them because you would slow down. I think the current setup and layout of tracks of having, by and large, tarmac, asphalt runoff areas where as far as possible is good, because it keeps more cars in the race, and ultimately you want as many cars in the race as possible. And now a lot of the times, if you spin out, so long as you don't hit anything, you're going to be able to, 9 times out of 10, you're going to be able to rejoin the race. But in the same breath, if it's quicker to run off the track, anyone who's played Mario Kart, it sounds like the sort of thing you do in that, cutting off the corner. So whether they can put something just at the extremities of the track, some sort of change the surface so that it doesn't have to be the whole way, but just a strip where you're guaranteed to lose grip and not gain an advantage. That is the easiest way to keep the drivers from pushing the limits of the track and stopping this sort of flip-floppery of the stewards, not just at a race, within a weekend, and from race to race. You want consistency. You want the drivers to know where they stand, and I just think the way it is at the moment isn't quite working.
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the refreshing things about a lot of the tracks that were brought in during the pandemic year was the gravel runoffs. Particularly, I remember first lap at Mugello, I think 3 cars went out on the first corners because it was just like first lap carnage and stuff like that just happens. And yeah, I mean, we're so used to nowadays to seeing cars run off, and if they're undamaged, they'll just carry on onto the track, and if they've picked up damage, then they will do what they can. To see cars kind of it's a bit hard to say punished in that instance of Mugello, but see people punished for essentially bad driving was refreshing, and a lot of drivers feel the same way. The problem is with gravel traps and with grass runoffs, it's just the speed that the cars can take corners now, going into a surface like that. Just the chances of you turning and then digging in, flipping, is very high, and that is obviously something that the FIA want to avoid.
Yeah, and this is why I'm just suggesting at the perimeter of the track is you just have some sort of surface which is very low grip, and you're not going to gain an advantage from.
With your knowledge of the history of F1, does this driver battle, can you see this comparing to anything that's happened in previous years?
The great rivalries of the past have all spanned more than one season. I mean, this doesn't have the opportunity to run for the next 5-10 years, because I don't think Lewis is going to race that long. But nevertheless, as a sort of a one-off, and I almost feel like it's probably going to be reset by the regulation changes next year anyway, to some degree. We obviously don't know how. But I think it certainly has the opportunity to be one of those iconic Prost, Senna, Mansell, Piquet, Hill, Schumacher, Hakkinen, Schumacher, Alonso, Schumacher. Schumacher was in a lot of them. He was a very good driver. Rivalries that have sprung up throughout Formula One's history and delighted the fans and the whole sport, because I think the sport is at its best when you have these rivalries playing out on a race each weekend, made all the more special by if it's between two teams which are really sort of gunning for it and gunning for each other. There seems to be a lot of good-natured competitiveness. It's going to be very interesting to see how that develops. as we progress through 2021. Is there going to be a controversial stewards call, which is actually a bit more contested, or a controversial driver move? Those are the sort of things that can maybe take this away from being a good-natured contest, which it is at the moment, to being a bit more feisty, and
which we all kind of like.
Yeah, and Hamilton Rosberg was like that. I always remember Rosberg sort of, after their duel in the desert in Bahrain in 2014, Rosberg sort of, when they got out of the cars, he kind of like jokingly sort of grappled with Lewis in a kind of, wow, that was a great tussle, mate. Really enjoyed that. Kind of playing this.
I lost, yeah.
This was it was a good-natured contest, but we can still be friends after the race. But that that quickly changed. So yeah, moving down the grid, I think, was Valtteri's race totally scuppered by a botched pit stop?
Probably not. I mean, it wouldn't have made a difference to the overall result. The thing is, you don't know what stuff like that does to the psychology of a driver. When you're like, because he was going well at one point. They were saying he was making good time, catching up, and then he went, and then at some point went in for this pit stop. The front right was not coming off. Jackman released too early. Jackman went back up, managed to get it off. So instead of it being 2 to 3 second pit stop, it was 10 point something second pit stop. And even though he eventually was, he was, what was he? Oh, he's 37 seconds behind, but he took an extra pit stop to get the fastest lap. So 20, what was it? Is it 26? So his pit stop probably, one, caused him to take that extra pit stop to get the fastest lap because he knew he was out of it. So his race probably wouldn't have, he probably could have looked closer at catching Verstappen or the top two. But then what the 10 seconds does to your psychology as a driver, you don't really know, whether you kind of feel like the race is out of your hands now. But ultimately he would have still come third. So,
and it was a sort of a typical Valtteri race where he looked good at points, but then couldn't sustain, or circumstances intervened, and then wasn't able to sustain his pace throughout the full race distance. And he's going to have to have some strong races coming up if he doesn't want to have to play second fiddle to Lewis in a drivers' championship. Because I think if there's a battle between teams for the drivers' championship, it's very unlikely you're going to have two people from your team gunning for it. One is going to have to play second fiddle to the other. Amazing. I think everyone was shocked when I think it was Jensen doing the post-race interview, said that was Lewis's first win in the first race since 2015. And so he started stronger than he has in many years, and it really puts the pressure on Valtteri, who looked good in patches, but again, the key moment was right at the start of the race to be in the picture, putting pressure on, being right up there at the front, and even just being 4 or 5 seconds off is enough to put you out of the picture when you can potentially only have one lap to gain time and around pit stops. Just stepping away and looking at the broader race, however they have to engineer every race so that there's a 2 to 3 pit stops rather than 1 to 2 or just 1. Just that variety. It just means that there's more variety and strategy that can be played out. And what was great, I think it's great with the tyre compounds they had this year, where it seems like teams are happy running on all compounds.
So that was one thing that surprised me, because I've been used to 1 stop, maybe 2 stop races. Do you know if it's the new tyre compounds which have caused the 2 to 3 stop on this race, or is Bahrain? I mean, I know Bahrain is considered a high tide degradation track, so is it being a 3 stop just the nature of the track, or do you reckon we could see more of these throughout the season?
I think that close competition at the front between teams is going to force more variation in tyre strategy, because if Red Bull were just able to run off into the distance and there was nothing Mercedes could have done, then that gives Max the opportunity to run longer in his first stint if he wants to, because he's not worried about being undercut, potentially getting into a window to make a one stop in the way that Lewis often did, Mercedes have often done in the past. Whereas the close competition at the front, I think, is going to innately trigger more variety in strategy, and more people running long when maybe risking a run stop, or people pushing for a two stop and backing yourself to be able to make a pass somewhere.
I can't remember exactly what race it was. It was like back in 2013 when there was this race, because of the specific conditions of the track, it forced teams to put in more stops than they used to, which was a 2 to 3 stop instead of it just being a one stop.
So you're thinking of Canada in 2010.
That's it, yeah.
That's the race you're thinking of. One of the best races of the year. And you're right, it did trigger people. It was this great race because there was 2 to 3 pit stops, bad tyre wear, and everyone thought, okay, we need tyres that wear. But I think there it was, what was misunderstood was that the key variable there was not that the tyres degraded, it was uncertainty of tyre performance. And for any element of sport, for it to be interesting, the key variable is uncertainty. That uncertainty varies from sport to sport, or in Formula One varies from track to track to race. But if you have uncertainty, you're going to have an interesting race. If everyone knows it's a 3-stop, well, then everyone's making the same stops at the same time. If you're unsure if it's between a 2 and a 3, that's interesting. To go against my point I was making earlier, actually, I would argue that a race that is maybe a 1, maybe a 2 is more interesting than a race that is definitely a 3, because you're not sure what you're doing. Yeah. At one stage, I think Red Bull thought that Valtteri and maybe Lewis were on a 3-stop because they came in so early for their second one. So again, it's not just uncertainty for the fans, it's uncertainty for the teams and not sure in what they're reacting to. All of that builds to create an exciting spectacle, and that's what we want, really, isn't it?
And so to go on this uncertainty again, it was it Mugello when they only had one practice? There was a race last season, I think it was Mugello, when they had one practice, and again, because of the lack of testing, it meant that they couldn't do all the scenarios they wanted to on track in testing, which meant in the race they wouldn't have all the data that they needed to know what to do. And again, it's the uncertainty that comes into it makes it interesting.
There is a practical piece around just not having enough time to do everything you want to. But again, I would actually come back to my point on tyre degradation and not knowing how bad the tyres would degrade. If the teams know they have an hour to practice, then they will build a program to fit within that hour to get what they can done. If they think they've got 2 hours, but one of the sessions is rained off, and they can't do everything they want to do, then suddenly they're having to think on the fly and aren't able to achieve everything that they wanted to. So it's not. I don't think, to an extent, it is the less time they have to prepare, the more uncertainty there is going into a race. But that's not the same as the teams sort of not knowing where they stand and kind of going into it a bit blind.
So I don't know. I mean, I reckon how many practices is probably a debate for another podcast, but I don't know whether going down to one practice would mean that the certainty just changes to a smaller amount of practice time, but you still get the same result of teams knowing what's going on. Just because, like, the amount, like, obviously so much of the sport is like data led now. The amount of data you can gain from 3 practices compared to 1 practice is so much greater that is where the certainty comes from. So even if you say, okay, so we're only going to have 1 practice over the course of the weekend now, and you say that for every single race, teams are going to have to decide what they're going to prioritise, and then what they don't prioritise is where their uncertainty comes into. So some teams might prioritise testing for one thing, some teams might prioritise testing for something else, and then maybe some variation can become of that. You're
right, and it would make a difference. But what would be better is if on Thursday the the stewards announced how much time they would have to practice, and then they'd have to work it out.
I do quite like that as well.
But that might be a bit gimmicky.
Yeah, should we go happy, not happy in the midfield now?
So happy, not happy. Starting with Lando, happy.
Yeah, Lando will definitely be happy because he what did he qualify? He qualified in seventh up to fourth, helped by the fact that Sergio Perez got, even though he qualified behind him, got then put off the grid because his car stopped during the formation lap.
Is he the first driver to literally be being wheeled off the circuit to then go on to finish in the top 5? I mean, full credit to him for pulling the phoenix out of the ashes. You know, it speaks to his tenacity that even as he's being wheeled off the track, he's still trying to get his bloody car to restart, control out deleting it, frantically pushing at the on-off button, and it worked. And then it was hilarious seeing him like shake his hands at the marshals, being like, "Is it working? It's working." Well,
that's what they were saying. He was trying to tell the marshals to not touch the car because apparently it gets into a grey area once they touch the car when it's like stopped. So.
I mean, I wonder if the race hasn't technically started, but no one is. So because he didn't do the second formation lap, he did one less lap than everyone else. So what input it probably meant he was able to run in a higher engine mode for a bit, but he actually covered a whole lap less distance than everyone else. He didn't do the full race distance.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I mean, I suppose because technically he was a lap down on everyone else.
But that's true of any car that starts in the pit lane, that they don't do the full. Well, no, it's not, because the race hasn't started when you do the formation lap.
No, it's
the race had started.
Yeah,
and he went straight to the end of the pit lane, and therefore didn't complete the full race distance. So technically, he was the first of the lapped cars in terms of the race distance. But I mean, it's just I think that's just an anomaly. But it's just something I raised because I haven't heard anyone else point that out. But it was a great. Yeah, it was a great drive from him, and it aided Lando. And, reflecting on where we said McLaren would be going into the season, it looks like Lando's fourth. He is best of the rest, and that was one position up on where it would normally be because Checo had an interfered race. So he must be pretty happy.
Yeah, because he just quietly went about his business, stuck around in fourth,
got racy when he needed to. Was good at the start. Got past Leclerc quickly, and he didn't race away from Leclerc, so clearly they were quite evenly matched. But he was still able to get past him. Checo Perez, happy or not happy?
Interesting one. Coming into a new car does seem to make a big difference. I mean, it shouldn't really be that surprising. And I think I remember Sergio Perez saying after the race he was just happy to get the kilometers in the car.
I was just really impressed that he's learnt the steering wheel, because it sounds like an odd thing to say, but they're all different, and presumably he was getting some help from his engineer, but to have gotten to grips with it enough to have worked out what he needed to do to get the car running again was one of the most impressive things of what was personally a pretty impressive race. I think he'll be happy with his own performance, but he'll be disappointed with sort of like the overall performance that he was affected by unreliability. He'll obviously be disappointed with his qualifying, but all in all, it was a good recovery drive, and at stages when he was running in clear air, he was very quick, comparable with Lewis and with Max. So again, it's the fact that he was out of position is something else that I think Red Bull will lean on and think, we went toe to toe with Mercedes with only one car at the front. If we've got both our cars running up there and it looks like Checo's going to be able to, that's another thing that another tool on their belt that they can turn to, hopefully, as the season progresses.
Charles Leclerc. I mean, I think if you're a Ferrari driver at the moment, you're just happy in general because the car is so much better than last year. And he qualified in fourth. He just didn't have a great first lap, but the pace is clearly there for them to be challenging for that number 3 spot in the overall competition.
They looked racier than I was expecting, and I don't think Bahrain was actually a good circuit for them either, because they were getting absolutely murdered on the straights. There was some. It was amazing how far back the cars were coming and getting past them
in this race.
Oh,
I missed that.
And but they were still overall quick. So I think they're going to be a car that works well on sort of turnier circuits, for want of a better expression.
A bit more of a Red Bull style car.
Yeah, exactly, that kind of vibe. So there's going to be, I think there's going to be better races for them, and they are more towards that midfield. So we called it a midfield 5. I think it's looking more like a 6, but it's kind of split in 2, with McLaren, Ferrari, and Alpha Tauri the top 3, and then there's a little bit of a gap, and it's close between Aston Martin, Alpine, and Alfa Romeo, who have been able to tack themselves onto that middle group, but it's kind of like the bottom rung.
So Danny Ricciardo's in 7th.
I think it's kind of thumbs middle.
Yeah.
I don't think he'll be happy. I don't think he'll be sad.
He wasn't happy with his race, but again, it comes down to the new car thing.
Mm-hmm.
Just getting miles under it, understanding it better, how you can push it. But I mean, the fact that he's got his 1 lap pace in qualifying is better than Lando's. I obviously don't know, but I imagine that uncertainty and unfamiliarity around the car probably shows up more over 56 laps. Which is why I just read an article. He says he wasn't able to get the performance out that he wanted to.
And I think I've heard it said that he felt better after this race than he did his first race at Renault. So he knows that it's going to be a journey this year to get up to where he's happy with, and if where he's happy with is where Lando is in terms of getting them more out of the car and the overall package, then that bodes well, because that means they're sort of towards the sharp end of that middle group, and are there to pick up any better places than sort of 5th if the top 2 teams have issues. Is Sainz sort of in that kind of happy not happy place as well, or do you think he's?
I think he looked very quick at some points.
I loved it. He did brilliantly. His double pass on Alonso and Vettel, getting past to sort of, that's 6 world championships. He got past in one swoop.
Yeah, that was going up the second DRS.
Never mind the fact that he was going past that one of them was his hero as well. It was very impressive. And yeah, there were. I mean, it's difficult to catch people's eye when the front of the race is so exciting and you're running around in the middle. But he had some really good peaks, I thought, which indicates that he's on the right, that he's started off quite well and is on the right track with a team that is also on the right track, if not where they would expect to be normally.
So, speaking of someone who started off well, Yuki Tsunoda.
I think, again, he'll be disappointed with qualifying. The team overall will be disappointed. They were better than 2 points. They should have gotten a hatful of points given where Gasly had qualified, and the potential that there is in the car, and the potential that I think Tsunoda has shown in testing and in practice in Bahrain. But ultimately, points on your debut, first driver to do that since Stoffel van Dorn. In the fullness of time, you will be happy with that. If you're comparing him to the other side of the garage, the more experienced driver who ran into the back of someone on the first lap, damaged his wing, damaged the underfloor of the car, he's going to be much happier than that.
Yeah, I think one of the pundits said he was the best rookie driver in quite a long time. I imagine that's probably since Max Verstappen, to be honest.
I can't remember who he passed.
He passed Alonso at one point because he was going on about it in an interview.
He passed someone and he must have been 50 meters behind him going into the braking zone, and he did, and he outbraked him going into turn 1. Didn't even lock a reel, didn't miss the apex, just perfect. Had the car perfectly balanced, cool as you like, up the inside from miles behind. Sort of not. It wasn't Danny Rick-esque because there was no. there was no brakes, there was no tire locking or anything like that. It would just he just was totally at one with the car and understood how hard he could push the car going into the corner.
There was another impressive one he did he did one at turn 10, which is like one of the hardest corners on the calendar, and he managed to come round, go up the inside. I can't remember who it was. Came up the inside at turn 10 and then just went off on the back straight again. Yeah, I think he seems to be a driver that's got a lot of control and a lot of flair. He's probably going to be exciting to watch.
And a bit of a personality, which is good to see as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, Aston Martin seem to be making more of the fact that they feel that they've been hindered by the regulation changes the most than Mercedes are. And I think there's only so many times you can play that card, particularly when you answer to Lawrence Stroll, who seems to be a particularly ferocious character. I think Lance. I mean, he'll be pleased to have got an A point, but I think he'll be disappointed overall.
Yeah, I think he'd be disappointed with the amount of points, because he actually was looking really good in much of the race.
They seem to both be running different strategies than a lot of the other teams, which meant they were at some points quite high up compared.
Well, I mean, Vettel was just on his own little thing, but Lance Stroll, yeah, he was looking strong, making passes. He was like, I think he was, I mean, obviously it's to do with pits, but he was up to 5th and 6th at some points, and yeah, he was going well. So I imagine that, given that Stroll proved that you can get performance out the car, I think he'll take a lot of confidence from that, because he was showing that he was kind of up there. And I think Aston Martin, whilst they will definitely be disappointed with the overall weekend, they will kind of see that there is something there that they can work to.
I think moving down, you can sort of take these two as a pair, because I think they finished 11th and 12th. Yeah. Kimi and Gio, I think they'll be pleased that they're clearly going to be. They've clearly made a step up from last season, and they're going to be in a position to score some points fairly regularly, with a bit of unusual races and some unreliability ahead of them. Ran in the points. I think they both ran in the points at stages in the race, and I think they'll be pleased that they're competitive with the cars around them, and are going to be able to have some fun racing with a lot of other cars. Yeah,
they're probably not going to be classed as best of the rest in the back markers now, so they'll be looking to kind of be pushing. Probably Alpine is probably the team they're going to be looking to beat, which unfortunately says a bit about how Alpine's race went this weekend.
Yeah, they seem to. I mean, Alonso seems to have lost none of his magic and his grit and his ability to extract performance out of a lap time getting into Q3, and didn't appear to have lost any of his racecraft. There were lots of side-by-side battles that he was involved in, and probably would have scored points, I think, but for his mechanical issue that he had. He seems. I mean, it's only early days, but he seems to have maybe taken a chill pill in terms of how he deals with the adversity. Maybe his expectations are set a little differently to where they were with McLaren, or he's just coming in a slightly different frame of mind. But he seemed to weather the adversity which he has suffered so far this season, both in terms of the car perhaps not ultimately being where he wants it to be, and then the unreliability that he had in the race, in a way that he wouldn't have necessarily managed that while he was at McLaren. But I think they're in the mix for scoring points week in, week out. I don't really know what happened to Ocon in his race.
I mean, he got hit in the back with Vettel.
Yeah.
And that was when both the Alfa Romeos passed him, I believe. And I mean, I don't think he managed to pick up, because if it would have been underfloor, like diffuser damage, but I don't think he did pick up much. It was just the time lost from the hit.
Vettel gave him a fair thwack.
Yeah.
And I think he was interviewed after the race and saying he wanted to get the car to the end because, to get mileage under the belt. I think any opportunity to get use racing as a test, it's worth getting that mileage rather than not. So he'll be pleased to have gotten to the end in that respect.
George Russell, I mean, there's not there's not loads you
Did he
can
finish
say.
ahead of Vettel?
Yeah, yeah. Well, Vettel picked up damage on his front wing, which took out loads of speed from his lap time. So yeah, I think there's probably a bit to say about Vettel. Russell, he just did what he had to do, which was beat his teammate and actually beat a few other people on the grid. So we can give him props to that.
He'll be happy.
Yeah. But yeah, Vettel. Okay.
There was a moment when he was dicing with Alonso and Sainz, and I think where he looked, I was like, oh, this is encouraging, because he was sort of going for it. He got past into going into turn 1, turn 2, turn 3, then came back up into turn 4 and looked kind of really racy, and you kind of felt like he was motivated by, you know, racing the guy who he replaced at Ferrari, then the guy who replaced him, and then he had a Vettel-esque lock-up. Well, there were two big mistakes into turn 1, wasn't there? There was one where he was on old tyres, locked up. Fortunately, there was no one to run into the back of.
Oh, he went deep.
Went straight on.
Yeah.
Which is the sort of thing that you do when you're on old tyres and you're losing performance, but it's not the sort of thing that you would expect a 4-time world champion to do when you're on old tyres and you're losing performance. It's unfortunately for him, it's post Red Bull, it's been a feature of his driving that he has made mistakes more regularly than any other driver I can think of, who's driven the cars that he's driven. And I mean, your instinctive reaction, I mean, the Ocon one, his instinctive reaction to sort of his interpretation of what happened when it's so far removed from the actual events, you can sort of understand in the heat of the moment, because yes, him, as far as I saw it, Ocon taking the racing line.
Ocon didn't move at all. He was just always on the racing line.
And him moving in underneath is going to disturb the airflow. You're going to lose downforce. But you know that as a driver, and you account for it. But you know, time and again he doesn't. It was up. You know, for me that was up there with him sort of crashing into Verstappen in Silverstone, whenever it was, where he just completely misjudged an overtaking manoeuvre. And on top of not getting out of Q1,
which turns out flags had nothing to do with it, because he went through them anyway. So he just put in a bad time, unfortunately.
It's not a good start for him, and I'm struggling to think of another driver who will be more unhappy with how they're weak. Oh no, I've just thought of one. But it says a lot. It says a lot about Vettel's race.
This guy's coming up.
that he's that's the only person he's possibly outperforming at the moment.
Yeah. Well, I was really I found it really annoying, because I actually do really want Vettel to be good.
Yeah, so do I. Totally.
And I was just willing. I was like, oh, I really hope this one stop attempt is going to work.
And Aston Martin need him to, because I don't think Stroll is quite there to lead the team in terms of being the number one driver who's getting the most out of the car. He's in the same boat as a lot of other drivers. It's a new team, a new car, but it wasn't a good start.
No. Pierre Gasly will be very annoyed at how his first lap went. He had a great qualified in 5th, and then just hit the rear left wheel of Lando Norris on going through the S's in the middle sector, which dislodged his. Because this is one thing I was wondering, because he obviously dislodged his front wing completely off, took it into the pits, and then he just wasn't able to get back into the race at all. He didn't have any pace, and obviously it must have been floor damage from which was just affecting his lap times after that.
And he didn't get it was a virtual safety car for that series of incidents, because Mick Schumacher spun off as well. So he didn't get the advantage of being able to close up to the back of the pack, and it just looked like he didn't have any sort of performance in the car as a result of damage which they weren't able to repair at the pit stop. It's very frustrating, I imagine, for a driver who clearly knows there's a lot of potential in the car, and in a clumsy first lap accident after a restart just runs into the back of the car in front. And he was unlucky in that it clearly happened at an angle which just knocked the wing off, rather than it just being partially damaged. It seemed to pop off as though it was attached by sellotape. So it was clearly a sort of a perfect storm in terms of where he hit it. But it's very disappointing, and just kind of puts a bit of pressure on him to perform at the next race. Yeah. Have we done Latifi?
No, I don't really.
He had a race. He was in the race and he finished.
And then, apparently he didn't finish. He got a DNF on lap 51. Does that mean because he just?
Oh, maybe they just parked him up.
Yeah.
I think we pick up a bit more on Russell because he's British, and obviously he had that run in. In the Mercedes, and he's gaining a reputation for being a good qualifier. But it's a challenge to sort of get recognition when you're running around the back.
You can get noticed for the wrong reasons when you're running at the back. Which brings us on to Haas, and particularly, I think, Nikita Mazepin.
Mazepin, more like.
So, for Q1...
Worst debut ever.
God, it was so bad. Q1 spat out twice.
I believe I think the second one was a mechanical issue, but nevertheless it didn't look good.
Yeah. Oh, okay. What did you know? What the mechanical issue was?
I've heard brake by wire. I don't even know what that means, but.
Oh, I imagine it's electronic braking system, which meant the electronics between the brakes and the pedal weren't working or something.
Why let the truth get in the way of a good story?
Yeah, and then coming out of turn 3, coming out of turn 2 into turn 3, just loses the back end on the curb.
I mean, it just looked like he took a little bit too much curb. He would have been on colder tyres because of the extra formation lap. But you kind of look at that and you think, when you see the cars going round, 19 as it turned out, going around lap after lap, more or less without incident, and then you see a car spin off like that, and you realise how easy it is to spin. It just goes to show how hard these cars are to drive, because he literally looked like he maybe took an inch too much curb, wasn't expecting it, and round he went into the barriers. And to be fair, Mick Schumacher span out, did the exact same thing. It was in the first lap as well. Yeah, like a couple of corners later. Luckily, there was just enough runoff, so he didn't hit anything. Yeah. So he didn't exactly cover himself in glory. So I must admit, there was a weird sort of symmetry of seeing a Haas fly off in the other direction. Yeah. I mean, Mick Schumacher finished, and seemed to recover from a disappointing start, but they're going to be running around at the back. With Haas, it's just about finishing, getting these rookie drivers laps under the belt, isn't it? What I will say for Mazepin is his English is excellent, and I'm delighted that he is a non-native English speaker who speaks with an English rather than an American accent, which always annoys me. But it's very in terms of his reputation as a driver, you've got to turn that sort of thing around very quickly, because when it's your first race, and this is most people, this is the first time they've sort of heard of you, although not with him, unfortunately, for other reasons. Your reputation can be made very quickly, particularly when there's a sort of hashtag around your name and changing it to what you do on the track. So so he will want to. So if he turns it around, if he's Mazza Spin at the moment, he'd be sort of like Mazzatron or something like that. That's a sort of like alter ego of him, sort of. Yeah. I mean, kind of feel bad for him. Kind of don't, but just it's something about. I mean, him and there are now two sort of drivers who they've sort of taken pay driving to another level, where they're not only paying for a drive, they're paying for a team. And I don't know, there's something about that dynamic where you just don't quite like them as much for it. On to what was the San Marino Grand Prix, but now the Pizza Grand Prix, according to Chris. Yes. Otherwise known as the Emilia Romagna Grand Prix. Can I put some avocado on that? And some chili oil? Can you do that? Do you do substitutions? You can do chili oil. If Emilia Romagna were a pizza, what toppings? Oh, it'd be like a classical kind of. It'd be a salami,
It's in northern Italy. Oh, I'm going to go to Interfood now, so that maybe
No, yeah.
it'd be, you'd be looking at a kind of like a salami meat-based kind of pizza as opposed to a lighter kind of thing. But I mean, they're ultimately just like bread and toppings and done really well. So, but Emilia-Romagna Grand Prix, we are talking historic one that's come back last season and then has stayed on the grid for this season, and has a mixed reputation. I think perhaps if you're a bit more of a purist, you've been in the sport a bit longer, you like it. I think if you're slightly more newer to the sport, and perhaps last season was your first race, you maybe think it might be a track that lacks some excitement in terms of how the racing pans out.
I was delighted that it made it back onto the calendar last year, and I'm very pleased that it stayed for those reasons about its connection with history. There have been some iconic races there for good and for bad reasons. I think the circuit lost a lot of its character when they changed the layout after 1994, which quite understandably and quite properly, I'm sure. I think it's a better balanced circuit now, though, as I said, with the changes they've subsequently made. I think from 95 to 2006, which I think was the last time they had a race there before last year, it was a pretty sterile event, where your only opportunity to make any moves were with pit stop strategy. So it really wouldn't work in a modern Grand Prix where you're not making calls based on fuel. But I think it's got more opportunities now for some interesting racing with the newer layout.
Isn't track width a bit of a problem at Imola as well?
Car width. I finally had it put into a context how big the cars are now. Is that Martin Brundle said they're the same size as an SUV in terms of how much space they take up. So they're
because I always imagine, particularly like the cars of the late 80s, just because their back wheels are so big. I think it's just 80s cars, not just late 80s. Their back wheels are so big. I always imagined that they were much wider.
Yeah, but you put them next to each other.
Is it just because these cars are also much longer now as well?
Much longer. I think they're the widest they've ever been. Obviously, the front wings themselves are the widest point of the car as well, and the rear wings are very large too. So yeah, they're long, wide. If you're on a narrow track, that obviously makes overtaking harder. But you want, as I said a couple of times already, you want overtaking to be difficult. It shouldn't be easy, but it shouldn't be impossible. And I don't think it will be. I think it's quite. They've got quite a good variety of circuits kicking things off this year, and we'll have a good feel, I think, from after the Portuguese Grand Prix. If Bahrain's a bit of a point and squirt, kind of like a power circuit, Imola's more twisty, so works your aero and your chassis, and so is the Portuguese Grand Prix. You're gonna know where you are by the end of that third race, I think, and we'll have a much better idea vis-a-vis the top of the standings, sort of who's gonna, if we're gonna consistently see that fight between the top two teams. So, in closing, looking forward to the Imola Grand Prix at Emilia-Romagna. And it was a great start to the season, and looking forward to the remaining 22 races. And remember, we are very much mistaken.